Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome into the Takeup. Uh, Here we are once again talking about one of my favorite subjects. You guys know that I love to talk about text. I know it's something that we've talked about a million times. But here's the thing, if we look up at everything that's on the wall of shame, wall of fame behind me that I often have with me these days, you know that a lot of what we have here, a ton of what is done in the embroidery world, is all about text, is all about what we can do with lettering, with our keyboard fonts, with other fonts, with font formats, with everything. The truth of the matter is, we are never that far away from text. And whether or not we ourselves are graphic designers or typographers, we may just be embroiderers here. And it depends on how far you reach into that world of typography, text, and graphic design. You will encounter both things that people do that warp and distort text, for good or for ill. Sometimes it's for fun. We're going to show some examples of that today. Sometimes it's because they don't know how not to warp the text and they don't know what types of fonts to choose to make things work for their fonts or work for their text. And sometimes we're also just dealing with people who have issues with default settings or the way that they decide to implement text or keyboard fonts. And if you don't know what keyboard fonts are, I'll go ahead and clarify that one more time. Keyboard fonts, for those of you not old enough to know the difference between keyboard fonts and fonts that weren't, back in the day, we had a type of font that was specifically able to be typed in. What do we mean? Originally, back on the old embroidery machines in the commercial world, we had a keyboard at the machine that would allow us to type things out, and new fonts were put into those machines by adding a piece of circuitry that allowed the new font to be there. That's way back in the day. But the difference between a keyboard font and a non keyboard font really is about typing. The non-keyboard fonts were not able to be typed. These were collections of individual files that had to be dragged into and contained within another file in software somewhere else. You had to put them together, or in the bad old days, load individual letters up and put them on something, put them together in some other fashion. You know, put these into a full layout. Now, truthfully, nobody here is doing that anymore. And the concept of a keyboard font is usually heard from someone like me who's been in the industry for some time. And usually when I'm talking about it, I'm just saying the fonts that are generally built into your software or are added to your software that are in a native format. Now, in the world that we have, and you guys know I work with Embrilliance, we have a font format that is kind of a world's first and had its own ecosystem. Now there are other folks putting together, I mean, Wilcom now has keyboard design collection kind of fonts, and it's very similar, but we had the BX format where we had the first ability to resize and work with stitch files and type out in those individual stitch file fonts back in the day into fonts. And then we allowed a lot of producers and publishers to make fonts that were stitch based. So now we have both stitch based and native fonts. And what do those two things mean? Stitch based fonts are essentially a collection of individual designs that make up a font. They're designs for each letter. And so when you put them in, they are not fully native. They're not vector based. They don't have the vector like shapes of a native digitized file or a native digitized font. And if you do resize them or work on them, generally they have to do stitch processing on that file, not just repopulate each letter, each object with stitches based on the settings that you would put in digitizing, which is what a native font does. Native font contains the original shapes that were used by a digitizer in creating each letter. And when we resize it, change settings, change things like underlay, we are allowed to then make that font as we would in digitizing, have different settings, have different fill types, have things that you can't do to a stitch file, right? We can alter things like underlay. And when we change the format, or when we change the settings on each particular letter or each particular word, we can alter those things. It will regenerate the stitches based on those settings rather than processing and trying to guess what those settings are, or doing the thing that other software does, which is trying to guess at the original digitizing objects and then reprocess them from the processed objects, from the recognized objects. Software like Embrilliance does this by analyzing the actual stitches and adding more stitches at the original density. It analyzes literal stitch penetration points and where those stitches are, and it understands what those are. Wilcom, other softwares may look at the stitches that are there and try to figure out where someone was drawing a satin or a fill and then refill that. And so those are the two kind of ways you can go about that with those stitch files or stitch based fonts. But generally, when we are talking about the gold standard of keyboard fonts, fonts that are able to be typed in, generally we're talking about native fonts, fonts that have those digitized objects inside of them. When you use them, when you change settings on them, they regenerate the stitches within and start fresh. They make a new set of stitches based on the settings and the size and scale that you set up when you're typing or when you're editing that font. So from there, I'll just say the kind of stuff we're going to talk about today really has to do with more than just fonts or font types. We're talking really about text manipulation, and it comes from a few different people asking me questions, and then me seeing some posts out there that were dealing with this concept of how do we warp lettering, how do we warp fonts, what can we do with text in order to make it fit shapes, in order to change layouts, and the concept that really kind of kept coming up, both between questions I had from actually an old article of mine resurfaced with a group of people. So I had a few people ask me questions from this article. I'll show you that in a minute. The concept, though, that kept on coming up was what is warping versus envelopes? Like, can we do basic warping? Is there something that's able to be done in very simple software that does not have any drawing or digitizing capabilities? So lettering software, editing software, what can I do with that? Is there a warping type that can be done there? And the other portion of it being envelopes, where we have a shape, and I'll just briefly define envelopes. So I'm going to talk about different types in a moment. There is a shape that we can draw that when we press that text into said shape, the boundaries of that shape warp the text, and the text goes to fill that shape. And these are actually fairly similar concepts. And I saw a lot of people kind of chopping it up, and also had these different questions about that article where there was kind of some churn in the water about what is warping, what is an envelope, how can they be used, and does some software have one or the other, or what does that mean, and what does it mean for what you can do? Frankly, I'll just kind of clear that up for the top types of software I've worked with and just discuss what's possible and show you some things, because you guys know this is a topic I know very well, because I made a product with Embroidery that deals very deeply with this concept of warped text. It's how I kind of came to be someone who gets asked this question pretty frequently: is what is warping? What are envelopes? How does that work? So I'm going to talk about the difference between warping text and envelopes. We'll discuss that a little bit. I'm certainly going to talk about some of those typographical terrors, how we torture our text and what it does. And then I'm going to discuss the difference between kind of rigid and free-form envelopes, what people do wrong about default settings, and we're going to talk a little bit about templates as well, built-in templates and applied templates, and just kind of discuss this concept of text manipulation, text and name drops. I know you guys would think, since I'm a custom digitizer, that this is not something near and dear to my heart, but I will say this. Though most of my art, most of the stuff I've worked on in my career over time has been custom lettering, even in the samples you see behind me, there's tons of examples of when I had to put staff names on things, where I have to add division names, where we are doing things for sport, that it does not require a fully custom logo type to be digitized from scratch. And in that, there's a lot of room for text manipulation. And I'll also say, in my later career and in my work with Embroidery, I've really been awakened to the fact that lots of people are customizers. Lots of people want to make text-based designs where they are almost entirely made of text, and that they are customizable. With the age of the internet, and I know that's going to date me to say it that way, with the concept of everything from Web 0.2 to the current version of the web, everything has been about customizability and individuality. And with the concept of digital decorating in the apparel decoration space, where we have these incredible numbers of just one-offs, full digital reproductions, people are very used to having everything that they're looking at customizable, to treating things like a template. And with that, I think more and more people in the embroidery space are interested in how we can have customizable templates, because we don't have the kind of fully automated ability to create things the way like we're seeing in AI with digital prints. We don't yet have the ability to go from concept straight to stitches without an intermediary art portion of that art and then digitizing. Moreover, because we don't have that, what we do have, what we can offer to this concept of, hey, I want everything customizable is once we've selected maybe graphical materials that go with something, here's text, and you can put this text in any way, shape, or form that you want. And with the advent of adding things like warping or envelopes, we can then better integrate the text into either its own design style or into the style of the template that we're looking for. So there's reasons why this has kind of come to the forefront and why it just keeps coming back up and up and up and down. Why we see people returning to that, aside from things like common style cues that have become part of the overall kind of the visual language that's happened in the last couple of years. So, like I said, we'll talk about that. If you're here, you want to talk about text manipulation, you're interested in warped text or envelopes or the crazy psychedelic stuff that I've done, and you want to know more about how I did it, how it gets done, the tools that do it, then hang out. We'll have some interesting stuff to talk about, though this should be a fairly short one. I'm going to try and keep it a little tight if I can. First, let's go ahead and say hi to the folks who are here. If you are on the replay squad, you guys know I love you, but go ahead and fast forward if you want to. You know I'm going to talk to the people in the comments. If you're here live, always willing to have a chance to chat with you and happy to have you here. Doug is driving home from Monterey, California with a brand new, to him, used Marrow machine. So Doug's not going to be chatting, but Doug, happy to have you listening in. Bonnie's in from West Michigan. Happy to have you here too. Ron's in from Windy Milk River. Good day to Ron. We have Barb coming in from North Central Minnesota. So happy Friday to you, Barb. We've got Frank coming in from the UK. Hey, Frank, happy to have you in. Cindy in from Texas, saying hi to everybody. Love that. We've got Lisa Shaw coming in, I'm assuming from Colorado right now. Hopefully you're home, Lisa. She's out teaching and educating all over the place. So if you are one of the folks who are out there trying to get deep education on brilliance and stitch artists, you better look at what Lisa is doing. She should be out and around you guys pretty frequently. We've got Scott coming in from Sunrise Tactical Gear. Hey, Scott, happy to have you in as well. Lots of people talking to each other. Love it. Ron's working on a Chamber of Commerce logo right now, building just about each letter. Fun and games. Yeah, no, custom work, and especially things that are incredibly small. There's tons of times where you need to do things individually. And so this is not to say that there isn't a ton of it. In fact, like I said, most of what you're going to see back here, custom lettering, but I do have a newfound, and if not new, not very recent, I have a much larger respect for the folks who are doing uniforming and name drops and customizing and gift shop stuff and boutique work, where they do a lot of use of these fonts, more than I had ever thought was out there, or at least more than I had taken seriously, even though I have always loved to type in custom fonts, as honestly as a custom sales tool as well. I ran tons of company stores, and in those company stores, I would make custom fonts for those stores pretty frequently. I digitize those so that I could match all of the stuff that's in their style guide. And it just made us look like the only company that could handle their business, because other people didn't have the embroidery fonts ready to keyboard the way I had. So it's one of those things that I think is also valuable to everybody. The font world is something we should all be looking at. Robbie's coming in from warm Vegas. Happy to see you here. Very warm here. I gotta say, I'm melting in Albuquerque. We're having record temperatures for us right now, so we're not set up with coolers and everything at this moment. Steve's coming in from Iowa. Happy to have you here. And Diane is coming in from Connecticut. So with that said, happy that you guys are in here. Happy to see you talking to each other. Community and fostering community is a big thing that we're about here. But let's get on to the topic at hand and kind of discuss what's going on right here. So, like I said, we're talking about text manipulation, but the first thing I'm going to bring up is warping versus envelopes. First thing, I am going to share with you guys a link to the magazine article, and I'll bring this up on screen here shortly. But yeah, this is certainly a worthwhile thing to do here. This is the article that kind of started back up some of these questions. I had somebody ask me about this particular one from Images Magazine. They called it tripping out, but really it's all about warping versus envelopes and talking about text envelopes and how things work. And honestly, I thought it was worthwhile to give you the article if you want it. I'll throw that into the comments right now. And in fact, I will go ahead and throw that up as a banner. So if any of you guys are watching this and can't grab the comments, I've heard a couple people say that comments don't come through on every version of this. Go ahead and screenshot that one. So Images Magazine. Yes, back in 2023, when I was first working on some of the tools that eventually became Ace One, the Rewind, which is over there on embrilliance.com. if you want to check that out. That's when I wrote some of the original stuff for these folks here at Images Magazine out in the UK. And there's nothing we need to necessarily stare at in the article itself. We will see here that there's a couple of those examples of what I said, that we had that really psychedelic kind of type that we have here, that we really are talking about how you get to that warped type, how you handle envelopes to make that happen, and the fact that some software suites have different kinds of warping, and that sometimes is not, or different kinds of envelopes, it's not really considered to be the same as the envelope work that you're seeing here, where it's very fluid and freeform. They have some very rigid envelope styles. And the thing about that is that they are still envelopes. Part of the thing that I'm going to kind of try and comment on and make sure folks understand is that even though not all envelopes are built the same, it is still in the realm of an envelope. And I'm going to kind of show you the difference. We're going to start in Embroiderance to show you what I mean by the difference between warping and envelopes, at least in my parlance, the way I talk about it. This is not necessarily what's going to be in everybody's manual. This is the way that I describe the difference between the two. And we'll kind of discuss what I mean between as like a difference between the two. For me, when I talk about warping in general, I'm discussing something that is a warping tool, that is a setting, that is not a shape that we can alter or drag, right? We're not going to alter, we're not going to add points, we're not going to drag points on this shape. We are going to set a setting, a parameter, and that parameter will let us change text somewhat. So I'm going to bring this up on screen. We're going to go ahead and try this out here. Just to let you know, we're in Embroiderance right now, and aside from setting up the shapes that we're looking at here, if we look at these pennants, this is something that would be present in any of the Embroiderance softwares, including the free express mode. If we select text, what we're going to find with our text selected is that we have the ability to change parameters on the text. And over here in the bottom right-hand corner, and like I said, I've been fighting with my pointer software for quite some time now. It's still not acting correctly on this latest install that I've got. But hopefully you can see my pointer well enough as I'm circling the end. I'm going to go down here. You can see that there are settings down here for this text. Warping, in my case, is when we can use settings like these where we have a slider or a number and we can warp text. So let's say somebody is just trying to add a little bit of a cant to the top and bottom, a slant to the this shape here for Western. They're looking at this word Western. They're like, well, I've got an pennant. It looks nice, but I don't know what to do with it. I want to have just a little bit of warp top and bottom to make that fit that shape somewhat. You might go into something like this. In this case, we have warps down on the bottom of here. We've got a curve, we have a grow, we have a peak and a shrink. We have these different things we can do to lettering, but a slider adjusts this. This is something that we are not going to grab a shape and move, right? So this is a slider. Nobody has to make a shape or draw a shape for this to work. Any text we bring in, and this is particularly in Embroiderance, but this is in other softwares as well. And I'm actually going to show you a little bit of something from Hatch later, just to show you what they do that's a little different, because somebody specifically asked me about their functionality on this very article specifically. But we're going to come back to Embroiderance to just say, hey, you just want to add a little bit of shrink to this, and we can handle that pretty simply. If we've got that selected, we head over to this top and shrink, and we slide that over to the right, and you can see that now we're shrinking toward the bottom end, and we have the bottom shrink, and we slide that over to the right, and now we have a little bit of a wedge shape, right? It does have some limits as to how much it will shrink depending on the size and scale and what have you, but I can use this warp really simply to make changes to that text, and I don't have to do anything else. There's no drawing of shapes, there's no pulling of nodes around, there's nothing else that has to happen. And if I am a customizer, if I'm somebody who does not have digitizing software, I can make these changes very simply, and I don't have to make any other sorts of shapes or supporting templates to make this work, right? So that's what a warp is to me. That's a warp. And in fact, just to kind of make it clear that there are other types of warps here, we can go ahead and select these, and I'll zero out the existing things we have. But let's say we have peak on the top line and we go up, it peaks that direction. If we go back down, it will crash the peak down into that top line. All of these are just kind of available options, and we can do these on any text that we import, or we can change the text after the fact, and it's going to maintain these as well. So honestly, it's all this sorts of stuff that we can do. We can curve, we can grow, shrink. All these things are very similar, and that warp is done with the sliding of a slider or with an adjustment of a number, and it's really very simple. Whereas we can do more, and we can be a little more explicit with an envelope. What I'm going to show you here is we're going to zoom in on this other text on Western on the bottom pennant here. And what I've done is very much like a cooking show. I have arranged this ahead of time. This particular little guy right here has an envelope that I hid. Now you can see that it is hidden. I'm going to go ahead and hide this flat text that's here. So this is the original text like you saw up top. But let's see this. We have the envelope shape here, and I'll go ahead and unlock that so you can see it. Here's my envelope shape. This is a vector-like shape. It can be edited. This has to be drawn in digitizing software, but we were talking about templates today. If someone has drawn this for you before in, say, Stitch Artist, of course, because we're talking about Embrilliance, and it is a specific graphical freeform template, and I'll talk about that again in a minute. You can alter it yourself if you have Stitch Artist tools. If you do not have Stitch Artist tools, what you can do is still grow it, shrink it, or type things into this envelope. And all you do is assign letters to it. You see this is named envelope 1. If I put a lettering object after it and I call that lettering object letters 1, I just have to change the name over here in the tree. Once I do that, this will lock into that shape, and you'll see that I can warp this text specifically to that pennant because this pennant has that drawn shape in it. Or if you're someone who has the designing software, you can draw the shape you want to and have it warp to that shape. And now, of course, if I change this from, Western to Eastern, let's just imagine that I was very wrong about my order today, and it's Eastern instead, well, it's going to warp back into that pennant shape very easily. And this is very much more like a template. And this is a free-form piece. This is a free-form envelope. Why do I call it a free-form envelope? Because I can add and subtract points anywhere on these lines if I have digitizing software that works with this software. In this case, if I have Stitch Artist, I can add points to these lines, alter the points, and anywhere I alter those points, we are going to get a warp. And if I change things like making something into a curve, I can then alter curvatures, things like that. And the font is going to follow that very free-form shape. Any way that I alter it, it's not going to alter or it's not going to restrict me from moving those points in any direction. And if I grab any one of the points that is on this line, I can then take that point anywhere I want to, up to and to the point of making the envelope not work very well. You can force an envelope to break the text if you want to. And you can also do very interesting things like make these bookend style shapes if you sit and work on the envelope individually to the lettering that you want to. It's a really great benefit to going back and forth digitizing software and lettering software. But the difference then between these things, and I'll back up out of all of these edits I've done, is that a warp really is going to be set very normally with text editing software. It's something where you are going to slide a slider. You're not going to be tweaking, drawing shapes, whatever you want to do there, but it does have some limitations on how far it might do some editing. I've got a fairly large pennant here, but an envelope is a shape that the outside bounds of that shape are going to warp what's inside of it. And it's much more like what you might see in vector software. And this is something I've covered before, but I thought it was worth kind of breaking it again because I had more and more questions about it, and it became something that was obviously important to folks. Another thing I'm going to show you, these are actually two different tab patches, kind of like pocket tab style patches from Patch Artist, another thing I worked on. But what I wanted to show you is this one, there's a provided envelope that's warping the text here. That's why this text is fitting this shape. It's actually being compressed into this envelope and following the edges. However, like I said, if you are making your own pocket tab and you are not provided with that envelope, the great thing is a warp like this, if we went ahead and set the bottom to curve on this, we could increase the curvature on the bottom and kind of drag this text into place or tap it into place. And if you're just doing something very simple, a very minor amount of warping, something that's not really wild, warps may be enough. Warps are very likely enough for you, let alone the fact that you can also do things like circular text or following text on a baseline around a path. These things are all open to you, but if you're trying to warp the shape of text, sometimes very simple warps are enough for you, or what I'm going to refer to in a moment, which is the more strict kind of solid, um, rigid envelopes also work. So that's something I'm going to talk about very briefly before we go on from this. The difference between software is often in this. Some softwares do their warping, their basic warping, through what I would call a rigid envelope. It is still an envelope. It's still a shape that allows you to alter the shape, and the lettering will fill said shape. But it works more like those warps where there's some limitations on what you can do with them. Whereas other software like Stitch Artist or Embroidery's templates in general, but with Stitch Artist, those envelopes are free-form envelopes. You can make the shape whatever you want. Yes, you can make the shape something that will break the ability of the text to fill it quite easily if you don't know how they work, and I'll probably talk about that in a moment. But freeform envelopes let you do things that are a little wilder, that fill in shapes without kind of restricting where your control points go. And that's something that was really kind of explored in that article. So rigid envelopes versus those freeform envelopes. And like I said, this is something I'm just going to show you because it keeps coming up when I talk to people about all these different options. And by the way, I'm just going to go on the record and say, though I work on these awesome softwares, if you have multiple kinds of software, I run multiple kinds. I have in my lifetime. There are times where you might want to use one tool from one software and put it into a file from another software, or something that's been digitized for you, and composite these things together. That is not abnormal. It's very similar to grabbing a stock design from somewhere and then compositing lettering on top of it. It really shouldn't be different. Mixing stitch files from different softwares too. So if that's something you're working through, that's nothing to be worried about. Ask questions of people no matter where they work and who they're working with. They should be able to be honest with you and say, here's some tools and here's how things can work together. So yeah, I've had people ask me and they get hush hush about whether they've done everything in Embroiderers or not. I'm like, hey, we are happy to live on your desk with the rest of your ecosystem of things that make your job easier. Use the tools that make the sense to you, including the tools that we've kind of made to automate some of this stuff for you. So again, let's go to rigid envelopes versus freeform envelopes real quickly. I think it's worth kind of understanding how they work. Very briefly, I'm going to talk about them as far as just showing you a couple of things that are in software. Then I'm going to show you where that kind of came up in that article. And unfortunately, they didn't show all of the illustrations that I had for this. And so it kind of was a little confusing to people when I discussed the concept. And that's why they wanted me to clarify. The magazine couldn't fit every little bit of graphical content I wanted to put in. So I'm going to go way back to the Wayback Machine for that article and say, here are the things that I wanted you to see. But real quickly first, I'm just going to show you what I mean by these rigid envelopes and why I think they're very much more like warps, right? So this is in Hatch. This is Hatch 3, in case you need to know. The way they do warping, it's very similar. You're going to see that there's both baseline styles, which is more like text along a path. And then down here, there's a thing called lettering art. So if I've got a piece of lettering here, so here is this word that says test here that I've put in keyboard lettering in a standard block. So we got like block 2. If I go over here to one of these lettering art shapes, you see there's bridges and arcs and perspective warps, stuff like that. What you're going to notice is that it actually places an envelope. Why do I call this a rigid envelope though? So why do I kind of make that difference here? Why is this a rigid envelope rather than a freeform envelope? Well, because if I go into this into the software and I want to edit that envelope, I cannot do more than what the envelope restricts me to do. I can move the control points up and down in the center, so I can change this arc. And what it really is doing is letting me kind of graphically do the same thing as a bottom or top warp. It is still an envelope. It is a shape. But by default, if I go in here, or even if I grab my reshape tool and I'm on this, you can see that I'm not able to drop points. I'm double clicking everywhere. I can't drop extra points. I can't grab the corners on this piece. And they're doing that to kind of help you stay to the format of the original art, right? And I can remove that art and take it off, but you'll see there's also different kinds. And what it does is now I have a sharp point here in the top and bottom. The sharp point stays sharp. These stay line segments along this edge. Can't edit, can't change them to curves, can't move them around, can't even when I drag on them, I can't move left or right. I can only move these up or down. In this case, the corners are editable, but once again, it stays vertical. I can't tilt these points around. So that's why I call it rigid. It's not that it is not an envelope. This is an envelope. It does function as an envelope. It has envelope functions. If we go ahead and throw like this perspective on here, I can do some pretty crazy stuff. However, what I can't do is add points, and I can't change these to curves, and it's not completely freeform. It will even let me do some kind of stuff that's close to breaking the envelope. Not entirely. Still has some controls there, but it will let me move those around. What I can't do is now add curves to it. I can't make this out of a vector shape. I can't do things like that. So it's not entirely freeform, but it does have envelope structures. So this envelope is there. It is a shape that I can attack, I can use, I can mess with, I can touch these nodes. So it is still an envelope, but it is more rigid. And this is kind of the most freeform version. But let's say I go to one of these other ones that has one of these other layouts, like the curve layout that's here. I now cannot attack that corner. I can't change anything else about it. I can change the curves up and down. I can't do the rest. And it kind of does restrict them, and they're built in. I can't make more. So that's why I call them rigid. This is not something that is pejorative. It's just what it is. This, if I move this over here, we can just say that that's a rigid envelope. It restricts some of the things that I can do so as to maintain the function of the piece. Even though, yes, especially on the perspective warps, you can do some pretty, outlandish reshapes. It is going to control me and stop me from doing certain things, and it doesn't let me make a custom shape and then make an envelope out of it. Whereas if we're talking about the envelopes I just showed you, and we'll go ahead and go to a different example, I've got these Easter egg patches here. You can see these warps that are in here, and I'll show you more about how they're created possibly in a moment if we get some time, or these envelopes that are here. The shapes are a lot more varied, and we can do some, crazy stuff. And each one of these envelopes can absolutely be altered, changed, edited, at our desire. And like I said, I'll show you a little bit more about how they're made. But any of these can be changed. And in fact, like I showed earlier, I'll go ahead and grab that one from the Eastern. We can grab the envelope that's here. And if we do that, we can go ahead and show you where once I am here editing, I'm in my digitizing mode. I can add lines. I can change the context of the lines and make them curved. I can change curvatures. I can alter that shape any way I want to, and it does not restrict the way I alter the shape. It is going to do as much or as little as I want it to, up to admittedly the point of breaking. I think the reason why we have rigid envelopes versus freeform envelopes like these, freeform envelopes, they're fantastic. They let you do a lot, but they do trust you over time to kind of figure out how they work. And they will let you do, crazy warps and psychedelic warps and all the stuff that's available out there. Like I said, in some of the products I've made where we have just an immense amount of warping. And I'll show you, we'll go ahead and grab stuff from Ace the Rewind where you can see kind of the crazy multi-line warps and shapes that we did for that piece, right? And these are things that require that kind of wild warping, especially when we get into things like the fun shapes or the dino. I'm going to show you the dino in a minute because I like that one. It's a funny one that we worked on. This guy here, these kinds of shapes are not available in a rigid envelope setting, but these kind of shapes, if you continue to push them, you can use them to break the generation of the stitches to some degree. The text can get weird. And so it relies on you a little bit. If you're going to go this far in a template, certainly you have to be a little more reasonable what you do. You start plugging in the works of Shakespeare into each one of these, and you're going to break something. But that's something that we're going to let you try if you want to. So they're freeform. They allow you to do a lot more free things, and they let you make shapes that you couldn't do in a rigid fashion. So you're going to have a wider range of all these shapes and options available to you, but you can break them. Whereas the more rigid envelopes, they are definitely available to let you warp text, and they do actually have a little bit wider range than maybe a parameterized warp would. It lets you get away with a little bit more, but ultimately it will stop you from flatly changing the shape that's in that art. It's not a negative. It just means those uses are different. The use cases are not the same for these, right? If we want something that's entirely freeform, we're going to have to go somewhere where that is available to us. And then you can make some crazy stuff like what I did here. I put together a kind of an egg-shaped patch border that I had done for Patch Artist. And then I used the text and drew some custom shapes based on with the fonts from Ace One the Rewind, and made this kind of interesting warpy egg piece that I put together just to show you this stuff today. But that's really the big difference between those. So not to gild the lily or make too fine a point on it, when people kind of talk about this warping versus envelopes, um, I just think of warping as being a little more restricted to the conventional styles, the arc under, the arc on top, the point on top, the point on the bottom, these kind of standard pennant style or perspective shapes. They are kind of set versions of what we would want to do with text. You can either do them with what I call a warp, with like a parameterized warp, a slider, or with those rigid envelopes that are there in other software where you can move the envelope corners and things, but it is not a fully custom shape. Or when we talk about custom envelopes, especially, like I said, those more freeform envelopes, the expectations for those is that we can make a custom shape and we can work with those. So that's the big thing, right? So when I go back to that, when I talk about that article and the other pieces that I've shown here so far, I think that the thing that we're actually asking is, am I going to have access to a freeform envelope versus something that's a little more rigid? If you want the crazy psychedelia, I know that we have it in Brilliance. I'm not sure everybody else does. A lot of the folks start out in vector software first and then make things based on that. In fact, that's something I kind of pointed out in my articles as well, is that we often start out from vector. At least back in the day, that was really the way we started. You can do some interesting things with freeform warps. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and bring up my monitor, or my second monitor here real quick again, and show you, even with rigid stuff, you can do things like, and I'll show you this really quickly. You can take text on a path, draw a curve, and then do a perspective warp on it. And that's two tools from a more rigid model that still get you a pretty cool warp if you want single lines, and you might have to tweak it to get multi-line. Where it gets hard is when you're trying to do freeform layouts like this, where you both that you want to do some kind of wild shapes that fit together tightly, or where you're going to not parameterize, but templatize these things so that the template allows you to change the type that's in there at will. That's a little harder to do, and you have to have a lot to be able to change. Or when you have like complicated curves, if you look over here in the Fillmore Sessions Hard over on the right-hand side, you've got a doubled curve on the top, but you have different inflections on the bottom. That's not really available in the rigid models. That's something where you need custom shapes. And especially if you're going to get goofy like we did and do things like the dinosaur element. This is one I made for Lisa Shaw specifically. She was looking at a sample that had something like this, but the type was just blearing out of the sides of this dinosaur. She didn't like how it looked as a piece of art. So I made this piece for her. And then being me with the dark humor I often have, we went from Let the World Hear You Roar, which is a lovely thing to put on a kid's jumper, to what I said, which is Let the Meteor Come Already. And I very astutely did not put my dark humor version in the software as the base text. I think that's really nice of me. But I was real tired at the end of making all the shapes for that. I'm just going to say I was ready to crater a little bit just toward the end there, but Let the World Hear You Roar is a much nicer message. But like I said, this is where we get into the free forms. So the real argument is not, do people have envelopes or not? It's is the envelope rigid or not, and what does that mean for you, right? So that's the thing. Like, do you have a rigid envelope? Do you have a freeform envelope? Speaking on behalf of the stuff I've done in Stitch Artist, that's freeform enveloping. But if you're a customizer, you're somebody who only has the text tools, the editing tools. If you only have essentials, you're not going to have those envelopes unless you download the free ones we've offered over the years, or you go buy a product that has those envelopes drawn, or someone who is a digitizer makes you a templatized envelope setup of some kind so that you can use it. If you want to make a custom one, you are going to get into the very base levels of digitizing in order to make a custom envelope that makes sense for you. So that's the first thing I want to talk about really quickly. I'm going to very briefly mention a couple of other things, like the typographical terrors, and a little bit about default settings, just very briefly. And then last but not least, what I'm going to actually show you is how I put together a custom freeform envelope piece. I'm going to just run you through that Easter egg patch that I made really quickly, just to give you a flavor for how I make those in comparison to how you might see that in vector software, or what it means to make them for embroidery software rather than just stamping them out the way you might do in vector software. So I'll do that briefly, but just quickly, I want to cover the two big kind of typographical terrors people do, and then a little bit about default settings, just a very small soapbox moment to get people kind of on board with using fonts the way that they're intended to. So what I will say first is, and this is no shade whatsoever on the person who is trying to make this stuff work. Um, Part of what got me on this, despite the fact that I had actually had questions about this, about envelopes in my email in the last couple of weeks, like I said, somehow that article surfaced and people were talking about it. I'm going to try and drop this out. I'm going to show the piece that I was showing before. In fact, let's put it on screen so I'm not staring off to the other side while I'm talking to you folks. Let's grab my screen here and say, the other thing I saw someone do, and once again, no shade at all. This is someone who's making their piece and trying to make their best of it. They had a piece like this, and we're going to go ahead and take the warps off of that text, right? So we're going to take the warps off the text. We're going to take that out and just see if we can show it flat how it was, and I'll explain to you what I saw. That kind of made me feel like I wanted to share this stuff again. This person was trying to make a nice banner that only had a few letters on it, and it was actually a piece like this. It was a pennant, and they started out kind of doing this, right? They were stretching the text and kind of placing it, and then each letter they were kind of stretching each piece and having each one smaller. Now, what I'm going to say is it didn't look that like terrible. It wasn't a bad piece. I'm not cursing this person for not working in some other way. I mean, they're working in the way they understand. They're working with the tools that they thought they had. Turns out they have more tools than they thought they did. But as you can see, when you do this, what you end up doing is, like, any horizontal bars that are in this get pretty warpy and weird, and you get this kind of stepped look, and it was a little rough, especially because the text that they had only had about like 4 letters in it. So by the time they had done that, let's put West on here, and I'll show it to you. Um, we ended up where the last letter was fairly small, and the first letter, which was it's quite a bit back further than this piece, it was filling in this whole area. The first letter was kind of huge, right? So as we get into this, first letter is looking massive, and last letter is looking pretty small. So it's like we end up with a pretty big bunch of stepped area, whereas one envelope would have made it a lot nicer to look at, or if they had used the warping. And I'll say this, their piece was fine, nothing wrong with it, but it does kind of show you this concept of, if you shrink or squish text a lot, you get some weird warping. Certainly, if we look at the piece down here that's done with the envelope, that's still warped. I mean, the width of the bar on the top piece here, top and bottom, versus what's here on the bottom, absolutely, there's some wild warping that's done in here. This is much thicker than the serifs that are on the end, the bars on the top and bottom of this end. These serifs and the top and bottom bars of the E are much different sizes, but because of the graduation, they look a little bit better. It's not quite how we see other folks get upset in the typography world, and I'll talk about that later. When you squish text and it makes it look really warped, this kind of warp looks a lot more intentional than resizing individual pieces. It actually does have that going on with it, right? It does have some, it does have that warping. We are not, using custom made type where we've individually made the letter thicknesses the same across it, and we drew everything in a nice way. It is going to have thicker areas. Also, because we're squishing the word Eastern in a horizontal, the vertical bars are much narrower than they might be in a normal piece of text. If I select this, you can see that the if I can get it selected on my software here. Sorry about the streaming software is kind of running slow. But if I select it, you can see when it returns that the difference between the thick and thins is a lot less. It's a lot less exaggerated than it is once we warp it. And that's just to do with the fact that we're warping inside that shape. So that we're still doing something that a lot of typographers don't like. We're squishing text, right? but it's a little bit different than if you resize text. So when I'm talking about the typographical terrors, it's like this. We're going to show you the two things here real quick. Um, Lots of folks, when they need a narrower typeface in embroidery, they have a tendency to just grab the text and squish it. This is the same font, right? So this is our standard block here. And in order to get narrow text, they just take standard block and they squish it on down. And we end up with a pretty warpy looking text. Honestly, because this is a very nice font, this is actually based on a typeface similar to a Myriad. It does okay. It doesn't look horrible, but you squished it. You know what I mean? It can look weird when you squish it or when you drag it out. Whereas what typographers like to do is use a narrow typeface. And in the case of what we have in Embrilliance, we actually used the same type family for our block and our block condensed. But this type family down here, block condensed, this is a condensed version of this font. It is meant to be thin and narrow from the get-go. So it matches the style of what we have up there, but it can go much smaller, much thinner, much narrower, and it looks more in tune. The thicknesses seem decently, but it is certainly better that way, right? It's certainly better to have that kind of thickness be more uniform than to take, say, the above font and squish it down until we get to a point that it's narrower enough. The thing is, it's a coordinating font. It looks a little better. Is it horrific to do this? Not really. And in the case of things like a pennant, a warped text, and especially if you make fonts that are made to do this warping, psychedelic fonts like this are absolutely intended for it. And honestly, most warped fonts, even if we go back to this example and we talk about warping of this text here in order to finish out this kind of tab shape, this rounded bottom arc on the bottom, absolutely not something that I would consider to be those big typographical sins, because they're done in order to fill an area to create this templated shape. So I would say, yeah, certainly we don't love always to see this kind of squishing of an existing font. Most of the time, it doesn't look too terrible on a block. If you do something that is more ornate or doesn't hold up to it, it can look weird, certainly. Or if you do something that has kind of a very monoline style, we take a font like this, and it is supposed to be very one thickness across the entire font, but then we go ahead and squish the heck out of it. We can see that it would have been much better if we found another kind of text style, Euro style font that had a narrow aspect, rather than have the thicks and thins be so off kilter for the font itself. So lots of folks do dislike that. But what I'm going to say is, though we can talk about this being kind of a typographical terror that we do in the embroidery world that not everybody loves, there's two things that kind of drive that. Number one, we may not have extensive families of fonts. We're very lucky in Embrilliance that the bold condensed, well, I made the bold condensed. And the reason I did it the way I did it was that I wanted to have it in the basic block font family, so that when you mix them together, the standard block and the bold and the block condensed, rather, the standard block and the block condensed are in the same font family. If you put them both on the same layout, they look like they belong together and they match. And we don't have the weird thickness problems. So that is one of those things, right? That's one of the reasons why we did that for type. However, I'm going to argue for those people who say, they tell you never squish type, because we may not have those fonts, sometimes we are forced to make alterations. It's all about balancing how the alteration changes things and warps things, and whether or not it makes sense for the design or what we have to do because of the limited area we're embroidering in. Number one. Number two, if we are doing something that is fully intended to be warped, that is absolutely the way it is supposed to look, like classic pennants, like warped text for, examples like this, where we have that Easter egg, we're fitting it into a shape, like my crazy psychedelia here. These things are intended to look like that. The warping is the point. This is no longer a typographical sin. And honestly, any of these simple warps, especially done with fonts that are meant for it, that are well engineered for it, and that don't look squished or funny, is fantastic. What is a typographical sin is if you go in here and start doing like all caps script. Go ahead and throw an all caps script in any of these, and trust me, you'll probably find that it is not the look you really had hoped for, right? those things are real. That is something you might not want to do. All cap script, yeah, that's not the go. That looks pretty nasty. It's not legible, but our eye is going to tell us that. Whereas a nice warping font that makes sense for it, whereas a font that is at least shaped in such a way like those blocks where they're not going to cause much trouble, or better yet, one that from the very inception of the font was meant to be warped nicely and that works in that space, is going to look great and it's going to be legible and you're not going to have to worry about it. So this is where I just make the argument that though I'm a lover of all things typography, warping and enveloping done artistically with the right fonts is not a typographical sin. And if anybody tells you you shouldn't warp or shear or anything with your fonts, number one, hey, that's a design choice. Do what you want to do. Number two, sometimes in embroideries we just have to use the most legible option that we have in the context that we have. We're dropping names over pockets, we're dropping names somewhere small or in an area where we can't have tons of text, or at least that it can't be huge, but we need to open it up enough for it to be legible and for our counters, our openings not to close. Sometimes we do a little stretching and warping, and that's just the name of the game. We can alter it, we can work on it, we can certainly try not to make it look nasty, but there are times where embroidery requires us to do some warping. So it's just one of those things I wanted to kind of defend and tell people that's what's up. But yeah, suffice it to say, I think it is a worthwhile thing to kind of reiterate that it's not that big sin that it is, that some people might say it is in the design world to warp text. And especially, I know they don't think so either when it comes to these artistic layouts like we discussed. Last but not least, on this kind of on the new business here, before I get into how I built some templates and what that means for me or how I do those things, especially specifically freeform envelopes, I just want to talk very, very briefly about default settings. Just to make this clear, lots of people come into their software and type something out in a keyboardable font and expect that the default settings, without any changes to that setup, to the various parameters we have on text, and I may even bring that up to just make a point about it, that is going to function correctly for them no matter what. This is still embroidery, and just like a digitizer has to do, you have to understand what underlay does, where you need it. You should understand what your density is, how close together stitches are. So stitch spacing, density, whatever you want to call it. Those things need to be understood, and how that works with the material you're running on. Even people who do customization and dropping text should understand that default settings might work, but that they're not necessarily going to track with anything you do unless you are using something like an active project advisor that sets up the parameters specific to the fabric. And even then, you may be called upon at some point to do things like increase the inset on your edge run or contour underlays so that they tuck in and you don't have marching ants of stitches around your borders of your letters. These are things that just need to be learned. Default settings, it's kind of like if you walked up to an oven and cranked the dial about halfway and just shoved in any food. The food is different. It has different requirements. It has to cook for different times. It has to be treated differently. You might have to put a cover on it. Embroidery is the same. Default settings are not the name of the game for everything. And quite frankly, I expect when I am using any kind of native font or asset to change my default settings in order to serve the particular garment that I'm working on and the particular materials that I intend to employ. So I'm not trying to cuss anybody about their use of default settings. What I am saying is default settings are there as a baseline. They do not represent specifically what is necessary for your fabric. And if you're just starting out, realize that you very well may need to change them. And there isn't one base fabric that is considered the only one most people run. And even when you think you are on said kind of base fabric that most people might expect, it's entirely possible for your particular hooping, your particular stabilizer, and other design elements in your design that comprehensively you've put together, the compilation of design and text you might have done with a stock design that cause things to shift in a specific way or cause extra stress on your garment that will require you to now change things like underlay, inset, pull compensation, or the like. You need to learn a little bit about what things need to be changed for what particular environments. It's not a bad thing. You'll figure it out. And luckily, if you do stitch outs, if you stitch on some sample material before you start, particularly if the material is something similar to what you're working on, if you've never used it before, you can then look at what has happened and adjust according to the sample. But default settings are not the universal settings that are most likely to work. They are just the default in the software. And particularly if you are doing something that has fabric that has any kind of extremes to it, thickness, texture, stretchiness, slipperiness, if it is extreme in any one of these categories, the likelihood is that your default settings are not necessarily going to work for you in the highest range of quality. You are not going to get the best quality out of them. So for keyboardable fonts, the chances are default settings are not the end of the road for you. Sample and adjust accordingly. There's tons of information about underlay problems, fixing designs. Even on this channel, you can search up avoiding design disasters or digitizing RX or digitizing disaster remediation. You can look up edge run underlays. You can look up pull compensation, and any one of these things are going to help you understand what's going on in the hoop and will help you get to where you want to be. So it's just one of those things. It is very, very useful to check that stuff out. And it doesn't mean by any means that anybody's unhappy with you when you say, I put it in the computer and it looked good on screen and it wasn't good when I got it on the hoop. I gotcha. Number one, screen's lying to you. What's in the hoop is the actual output. And unfortunately, fabric is just such a fluid living thing when we're stabbing thousands and thousands of holes in it and leaving all that thread through those holes that you're not going to get everything you want from the screen as far as previewing. You're not going to get a perfect preview. It's very fuzzy logic. You need to look at that sample and adjust accordingly, but you are going to get the hang of it. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just something to understand. There are variables. So we do have some different things to talk about here. I've got a couple people asking questions, so I'm going to answer a couple questions and then show you that very briefly, that egg design that I showed you, the egg patch design that I laid out, and then we'll end here for today. Suffice it to say, no hate for people using default settings. I just want you to understand that they were never intended to work for everything. That's just something that we have to understand as embroiderers. And as you get better into it, more stuck into it, more experience, you are going to learn that stuff. It will become second nature to you. You'll know when to swing a little wide on your compensation. You'll know. You'll pick up a garment and you'll feel it. Also, just look at garments and understand that they have different kinds of stretch and feel and sink and slipperiness that are going to change their characteristics in the hoop. It's just the way these things are. But we have some comments here, and I want to go through. There's some stuff people have asked. Lots of stuff, actually. But we will check in and see. First thing Cindy says, and about enveloping, can I do a lot of this in Patch Artist? You can do this if the envelope is provided for you, if it's in your software, or it's in your design. If somebody has given you a template, whether it's a free Brilliance template, or you buy one of the font packs that has templates, or like Ace, you can do that in any one of the softwares you have. And in fact, Patch Artist, by default, does have some of these samples that have enveloping in them. If you just want to look at what an envelope looks like, you won't be able to alter or change the envelope. You won't be able to drag points and shapes when you do that, but you will be able to just try out an envelope if you want. Also, you'll be able to use those free envelopes that I showed. There's actually, if you look on the Embroider's website and search for envelope, there's a set of free envelopes that anyone using any version can use with keyboard native fonts. Even on Express, you can use them with native fonts. You can't use them with stitch-based fonts unless you have essentials. However, for Patch Artist, I'm just going to bring up the Patch Artist sample pieces, the things that are in Patch Artist, and you'll find I have different libraries you don't have because I build things and test things. But in a lot of these, they actually by default have envelopes built into some of these. And I'll go ahead and grab one where an envelope is shown right on the top. So I think we have in the shoulders and tabs here. See these upper and lower? I'll go ahead and grab one of these. These have envelopes built into them. So if you look at this upper and lower here, these envelopes are built right in, and this was tag 9. So right here, it's using the patch artist fire type. And if I just said, if I said Burke, why not? I am here and I'm being funny. Burke. And we set that up in here. It's going to go into the envelope automatically. And then if we go here and I said, fire DEPT for the heck of it. should I be able to see it while I'm looking at my tiny monitor in front of me that's provided by my streaming software? And we pull off of that. That will work in the envelope. So if you have an envelope template in front of you in any of the Embrilliant software, if the envelope is already there, you obviously can do that. And in fact, the other thing I'm going to point out here too, if you select these in Patch Artist, you're going to see that there's these notes down here. Over on the right-hand side, you'll see there's notes and baselines. Each one of these patches, I created envelopes and also baselines where we can put text that goes along paths inside of there or fills an envelope inside of there. And there's usually more than one option for each piece. So let me close this out. We'll go ahead and make another new design so that I can grab one more of these just to kind of explain what I'm talking about. If you are in one of these other kind of patches or shields, you're going to find that there's multiple lines in here. What you might also find is that there are both envelopes. It's like an envelope thing, or you can use an arc or something else. In this case, text 2 is assigned to envelope 2. If I select this in shield 11, we see that text 2 right here is warping into that top side that's there because it's got an envelope. It's got a shape that it's adhering to. But we can kind of see this curve in here. If we check our notes, we can also see that there is a top arc on something called baseline 3. So if we name the object letters LC3 here, which we can do, we get into our letters here and call this letters LC3. So I'm going to attach it to that baseline. Oh, I used the wrong lettering. But what you can see, I'll go ahead and take this one out so you can see what I did. I accidentally used the wrong lettering object when I did that. I'll take this out. I moved that one that was on the bottom line up to that top arc. So most of the Patch Artist stuff has multiple lines and envelopes in it, so you can make different decisions about where your text goes. And if you needed to put something on this top arc, maybe this is where it said, Burke for your particular city. You could put that on that arc, or if you wanted it inside of that envelope instead, you would just assign the name that was listed for you in the notes. And then that same text would then space out into that envelope. Also, when you're in here, you can see this because of the spacing that's on here. This recognizes the spacing in the warps down here. If you change your letter spacing, you go ahead and zero that back out. You can actually use different letter spacing as well once you regenerate it. So you can actually go back to original letter spacing on one that has extra spacing in it. So that I know that is very specific to Patch Artist. I didn't want to just kind of run on that with you guys, but that is what was asked about. So hopefully that kind of helps you. Embrilliance, if you have any of the Embrilliance software, including Free Express, you can use pre-made envelopes with native text. So stuff that's digitized in Embrilliance, like the block font that's in there. Or if you have Essentials, we have the ability to warp stitch-based fonts, BX fonts, and native BX fonts. And if you purchase any of the other software that has envelopes in it, whether that's Patch Artist or especially Ace One that has all the super warpy stuff, and I'll bring that up just for the people who may or may not have heard of it. I can go ahead and open that up and just kind of bring up a library. So we'll do that really quickly. If you have Ace One, the Rewind, which is the one that I was talking about with all of the super crazy psychedelic stuff in it, that if you have that, you don't have to have anything else to use those envelopes that are in there. You don't need to buy another piece of software unless you are going to use non-native fonts that you buy from somewhere else, stitch-based fonts. Then you're going to have Essentials so that the stitch processor that's only available in Essentials will do all the warping and stuff to a stitch file. Otherwise, if you're just using the fonts that come with Ace One and the envelopes that are with Ace One, that's all you need. You could buy Ace One by itself and still make this stuff, but you wouldn't be able to do anything from the other modules. You wouldn't be able to use it with like stitch-based BX fonts that you might find online or buy from someone. A lot of the very inexpensive fonts are stitch-based. They're actually outputted as stitch files from other software, and then we do the processing and warp them, but that requires Essentials. So yeah, I know, inside baseball, but that is that's the question at hand. We have a couple other folks saying hi. Hello to Bernardino. Hopefully, I've said that correctly for you, man. We've got Joanne coming in. We've got glad to see you. Have been missing the shows. Glad to see you here too. Uh, B says she thought it was spelling mistakes. Oh, I thought you meant spelling mistakes. Is it me, or if you stare at a single word so long you wonder if it's spelt wrong? Absolutely. Also, I'm going to say that in the world of both embroidery and apparel decoration, I always joke about the word shirt. I've seen the word shirt so many times in my life that it starts to look like has no meaning anymore. It is a widget. It doesn't have any value aside from object now in my head sometimes. But yeah, it's funny how lettering can look right or look wrong. And it's wonderful that how our eyes and brain coordinate. I agree, Joanne. We actually have the ability to see a lot of these things anyway, but double checks are always worthwhile, as you guys were talking about. So lots of that stuff going on. I love that everybody's chatting. Gail says about the default settings, and I agree. Embroidery has so many variables that each project is unique. Absolutely. Joanne says there are so many factors. I always say that stitchers are some of the bravest folks on earth sometimes. And that's also why you always test stitch. Yes, Gail, absolutely. Test stitching is absolutely, um, absolutely there. So, and Gail said, I'm just going to go ahead, since we're talking about Patch Rush real quick, I'm just going to talk about it briefly. She says, does Merrily updated all the features of Patch Artist? Patch Artist is the updated form of Merrily. If you have Merrily right now, go get the Patch Artist stuff, use the same serial number, and you'll have everything. Patch Artist had all that enveloping stuff was already there. It just got more of it. When we did the Patch Artist rebrand, I added a lot more of those pre-made envelopes and baselines for folks, as well as more fonts and stuff. So yeah, go check it out. It's fun. Thank you guys for loving on Patch Artist. That's a project near and dear to my heart, though it's been out there for a while. And the other one being, like I said, Ace One is another one that's near and dear to my heart. And last but not least on that score, Joanne says, silly question, but do warped letters cause a different push and pull than a straight up set of letters? I'm going to say yes, but probably not for the reason that you think. And I'll go ahead and bring up the screen share for this. Why I would say they do and why people might have a little bit of struggle with them is if you look at something like this, where we have these different letters in this piece, you can even see it here as I zoom in on Hoppy Easter. If I turn on my points, you're going to see how these letters have stitches in them that are so long in the top, in the O of hop for this Hoppy Easter kind of artistic broken up text that's on here. They're so long that we have a lot of short stitches and puncture and we have drop points and stitches in the center of the line. We have really long stitches at the bottom of the O where we have kind of short stitches in the horizontal. We have really long stitches in the vertical. Because warped text is just more likely to have these really long stitches and short stitches, stuff like that, I think you do sometimes see some variation in pull and push, mostly because we have some really long, wide columns, long stitches that tighten up, whereas we will have narrower stuff in the vertical, especially as we smash lots of lettering into a small space. Like right here, I have good egg. If I go over here and I click the text for that good egg here real quick, and I just put in here excellent, that's going to get close to almost breaking some stuff because it's really tight. And so what you're going to see here is, looks like it's still going to hold up. I think we can still pass this. The N is a little tight, but still going to work out at this size. But you're going to definitely see where we've got a pretty big difference between our widest stitch in this E and the narrowest stitch. So you're probably going to see a little bit of extra pull in the top and bottom. And you're going to see as you cram more lettering in, our spacing just gets tighter and has to be adjusted. So there might be some different warping. I don't think it's as much on the material side, aside from that, those really long stitches. Really long stitches are always going to cause a lot more draw toward the center, especially satins and they're on a soft material. This case on a patch, I would not sweat any of this. But like I said, the more crazy you go, the more wild you go, the more stitches you jam in, letters you jam in, obviously you're going to see stuff kind of get crazy. So yeah, like I said, Cindy says, since they're on patch style fabrics, is it much more stable? I think so. They still push and pull, but it's just a lot more stable if you have a big hooped span of polyester than if you're throwing it on a t-shirt. That's just the truth. It doesn't mean it's not. It depends on how you make your patches too. If they're kind of floated on like appliques, it's less stable than if you do big slabs of material, cut them out, and then edge them after the fact. Then your designs aren't going to have nearly, if you've got a full span of hooped, polyester twill, that's going to be like iron compared to something that's really stretchy like a knit. So yeah, it depends, but still it depends on that stuff, not so much. Anyway, B says one more thing. So we're talking about, we did talk some inside baseball here. My designs are all on cardstock, so do not have patch artists and make my own fonts, especially for cardstock. Can I use my own fonts and envelopes? Absolutely. Envelopes are not a specific piece of one of the softwares. That is an Embrilliance feature. If you have essentials and someone draws you the envelopes and you bring that BE file up, you can type things into those envelopes. You don't need more than the base to make that happen. I do recommend Essentials because if you go download BX file fonts, Stitch file fonts, and you want to use them, Essentials is what lets those warp and change density. Otherwise, yeah, you don't need something special to do that. If you want to draw your own envelopes, then you need Stitch Artist 1 or above. Otherwise, that is just part of what's available. Envelopes are just a basic part of what works. And that's why it allows us to use our own templates. We can make templates for people to then use. And that's something that we have done and have liked to do. So yeah, very, very nice. So Gail says, I make my own fonts, so glad to see I can use them for envelopes. Yeah, especially if you make your own BE native fonts. Yeah. Now, don't get me wrong. Some of the stuff that I've done to make fonts work better for envelopes. Why is ACE1 a thing? ACE stands for all capital enveloping fonts. That's what ACE stands for in ACE1. The fonts are made where they don't have ascenders or descenders that break up the lines, so they tuck really nicely into a multi-line layout. I drew the fonts to work for envelopes. You can use any fonts in the envelopes that work in Embrilliance, provided you have essentials for the stitch-based ones. But they may not work as well if they have large ascenders or descenders because they'll shift where the font rides inside of that envelope. The tallest thing on your font will be where the edge hits that top line of the envelope. The deepest descender on your font is where that is going to ride on the inside bottom edge of that envelope. If you don't have a font that has no ascenders and descenders, it won't hug those curves perfectly. So the font choice is important to that too. So it is something worthwhile to look at. Yeah, very, very well worth it to look at. Like I said, something that you should see. And I'm going to very briefly now just go over the making of envelopes. We're going to make this a very short kind of guide. But I do want to dispel a couple things about envelopes. Since we're talking about making them in Stitch Artist, we're going to go very quickly with that. Gail says, and I'll just go ahead and answer this one because it's easy. How would script fonts work in envelopes then? Not the best. It's not that you can't use them. It's that you have to be aware that if you have big capitals and little lower cases and descenders and ascenders, that the entire envelope is the space they'll fill, and they'll go to the top line and the bottom line, and the tallest and the shortest and the lowest element of these things are going to define where they land. If you understand that, you can draw your envelope to go larger, perhaps than the area you want the font to be in, so that it hugs that area the way you want it to. But they don't work as well because they are going to run up against the edges, just kind of the way they are. Yeah, not a problem. Not a problem, but they don't work quite the same. And if you're trying to do the crazy shape stuff like I've been showing, and especially what I'm going to show right now, those work best with block fonts or fonts that are made to reduce those ascenders and descenders and the differences in those. And definitely all caps is best of the best on those. Just a wonderful thing. So very, very worthwhile. Like I'm going to say, it's not for everything, but it does work. And we do have to still employ our inner graphic artist to make sure we're using the right choice stuff with it. Like we have to use the right assets with our project to make it work the best. So very quickly, I'm just going to show you, this obviously is a fully templated piece. What I mean by that is if you had this file in front of you, you could change any of this lettering. You could grab any of the pieces that are in here and alter the lettering and change what was in any of these pieces. So this is a templated piece. This has been made with envelopes. You can see here that if I open up these objects on the right-hand side, we have envelope 1 for the top, envelope 2, and envelope 3 that make up this egg design, right? This egg patch that has these 3 elements in it, right? The thing is, everybody kind of wants to treat them the way that vector software does on envelopes, and vector software does something very similar, but it artificially makes what I would call stops or ends on those shapes. Whereas if you're working in Stitch Artist, you don't have that. You have to make those yourself. So what I'm going to show you is kind of a process of the good and the bad and the ugly, what people think you should do versus what you actually end up with, right? So what usually happens is someone will come up with the inside edge of a shape. If we look at my Easter egg patch here, you can still see I actually have this. This was a baseline that I could use to make text crawl around the inside of that egg shape is actually what that's made for. But that's a little inset line inside of that Easter egg patch where I don't want stitches to go beyond, right? Well, most people will say, all right, I want to cut it into 3 kind of warpy pieces. I'm going to drop these cut lines on the top and bottom of this piece, and we're going to cut this in 2 pieces. And by the way, I'll answer this question very quickly. Gail says, with Stitch Artist 3 Enthusiast Patch Artist, I can make my own envelopes. Absolutely. Stitch Artist 3 will have everything you need to draw these shapes. Yeah, you should be fine. What I will say is because if you don't have essentials, you will not be able to warp Stitch-based BX fonts. That's the difference and the thing you should watch out for. All right, let me get back to this. So this is that inset line that we had in the egg. You can draw this little warped line, and honestly, I just drew it with points. So I just have these little drawing lines. I dropped another one here. And the first thing people do is go, okay, I'm going to do that. So they grab these 2 lines, they grab the 3rd line here, and what they end up doing, they go up here and they well, at first they'll select the 2 lines, right click it, and because I don't have them both selected, it's not going to work. Here we go. And we say combine with break. So we make break lines, right? And then once we've made the break lines, they'll grab that shape that has the break lines attached to it, and you'll see up here that we have the ability to cut an object at break line. They'll just cut them at both of those break lines, and they end up with this, right? And they expect that this is going to give them the result that we have over here, right? These kind of retro shapes. But what ends up happening is, number one, there's no spacing between these envelopes. And because the text is going to go all the way to the top and bottom, even if it was set up correctly to work vertically, it's not going to work the way you expect it to. It's going to go all the way to these edges with no spacing. And then the other thing I'm going to show you is I talked about the ends. Every envelope has to be like a rectangle. An envelope expects to have a set of ends or corners on it. And if it can't figure out where those ends or corners are, it's going to assume where they are. So this is a properly formed envelope. The beginning and ending point is in the upper left-hand corner. And these verticals that are on this shape are going to define how the text lays in this envelope. So let me rename this into envelope 4. And I'm going to show you kind of how this works. So this is envelope 4. And we rename this to letters 4. It's going to pop into that envelope. And what I'm going to show you is it orients itself properly vertically because it knows that it has its corners. We got a corner here, and it knows where the 2 sides are. And when we change these angles, that changes the vertical orientation of kind of the spine of those fonts. They follow that angle, right? That's how that's going to work. And no matter what we do to this shape, so if I were to go in and add a point like I did here, and I change that into a curve, and I change this into a cusp, and now I've got access to a pretty nice curve that I can play with and start to warp it, it's still going to make the verticals associated with the angle of these 2 lines. And if I break it too far, it's eventually going to say, okay, that must not be the end. Like if I break the start line too far, it's going to think these 2 points here are the end and that this is the end of the rectangle because the lines don't match up. We don't have a left and a right end. And that's actually what you're going to see over here on the side. Because we have not assigned those ends, because we don't have those corners, this shape, if we just assign it as an envelope, is not going to work and create the egg shape we want. We just cut it. Number one, everything is right along this edge. It's not at the right side. And we've got these verticals. Why? Because it's trying to figure out where the corners are on this shape, and it expects that upper left-hand corner to be there. And if we look at this particular shape right here, this right there, this corner is acting like it's at the upper left-hand corner. So what I'm going to want to do if I want it to be vertical, the very first thing I'm going to have to do is figure out where my corner is. Here's where maybe I would expect it to be. I'm going to break the shape and start that again. I'm going to remove this piece. And if I go back in here and then try and reassign those letters, it's probably going to have a much better option. It's going to say, oh, okay, that is where my vertical is. that's where my corners are. And I'm going to assign that a line shape. And now it's going to be vertical. And now I can go back over here and start to work on where would my vertical be over here, right? Where's going to be that vertical end to make that work? And I'd say, okay, here we are. I can start to figure out where my vertical end would be. But we can see that shape doesn't look like the shape from the egg. We have to make some alterations. But even if I did that, now I have no spacing in between. So the second thing we can do, even if we just make that center line, we go ahead and get a copy of that center line. We copy it, we paste it, and then we assign it. We tap it up into a spacing that we like. And we drop that in and we make another line just like it. And we drop that into another center that we like away from that center line and say, all right, that's a good amount of spacing. I like that for my design. We assign both of these as break lines. And once again, once those are assigned as break lines, we grab these, grab the other lines. We can grab all of them together. I'm just going to show you again. It's a right-click option that we would combine with break. And then we would go over here and we see if you have Stitch Artist 3, which is what I'm using. By the way, these are Stitch Artist 3 tools because I'm using graphical operators. Then we can go ahead and work on that piece that way. By the way, Gail says, can you rotate the lettering within the envelope rather than assigning a different base start stop point? No, you can't. Because what that's going to do, that also allows us to do things like, why do we have to have that start stop point there? Because if I grab this entire piece, this my good egg piece right here, and let's say that it's not a patch, but it was going on a design. If I grab the entirety of this thing and I want to rotate it, now that text has to figure out where it is in space. Now, in this case, this guy got a little panicked and I'll have to reassign him again. But how is it going to figure out where it's in space? It's going to look for those corners. And because my corners are here and here, it's going to know that I want the text to follow that line. So if we want to use those envelopes on any other angle but straight horizontal, we have to have those indicators there to make that work. So no, you can't just rotate the lettering. If you rotate the lettering, it'll do the same thing. It'll just warp it back into that position again. So yeah, that's what it's for. It's for giving you that orientation, because that's wherever you want it to be. If you want your lettering to all be vertical, you could. You would just assign those same points the way you want to there and then rotate it into space. So you would still be able to have things be at a different orientation once they were finished. Like I said, if you rotate this thing horizontally, you might find, I don't know why this particular text, I must have done something weird to this particular text, but when I said it, I think it's grouped in funny. Still, you will have it follow and trust that corner is the orientation point. So that allows you to do that stuff in a way that is a little more predictable, no matter what happens to that file once you let that template out into the world, So I showed you that spacing. Essentially, that's one way to handle that, is just to copy your shape and then tap those lines up and down and then cut your break line after that. But as you can see, even after you do that, and now we've got nice spacing on here, we're still getting some aberrations on the left and right hand sides. We're still getting some weirdness with the orientation, and that's all to do with those corners being present. So the actual shape you want, you're going to work on that shape a little bit inside of your final design element, and you'll see these are the shapes that I ended up with. Why did I end up with these shapes? Because as I was working on them, I started looking at how that lettering was going to run. And I thought, all right, well, I've got these envelopes here. I see how they're running, and I want the corner to be a little high here. I don't want it to be that far away. I don't like the way that it's warping, particularly in this one area. I think maybe, in fact, this might be a little too narrow, and I want to make sure that I want to angle this back in. In fact, I think it's actually a good change to angle that back in to get a better kind of shape to things that follow up into this corner so they don't get too compressed. And you just play with that line and say, all right, yes, I'm following this general shape, but how do I do it in such a way that no matter what text I put in this, if it turns from hop to ham, how am I going to make sure this is going to work as a template? And I think about the different letters and how they're going to warp into these corners. And it's one of those things that requires you to do a little bit of playing if you are making this file as a template and not as a one-off. If you're doing it as a one-off, you can play with those outlines until you just get the letters where you want it to. It's still easier than doing this by digitizing each piece. I mean, you can. Certainly, like I've said before, that is how we used to do it back in the day when we wanted to do this kind of warp. Well, what we would do is we would create this warp in vector software like this, and then we would go back and we would digitize individual objects on top of the original, because if we didn't, if you auto converted, we get all this horrible junk out of the file, where the E's don't look like each other, where things don't break along the lines they should. We can't just convert SVG, especially when we do a lot of crazy warped shapes or EPSs or whatever vector we had. We had to redigitize these pieces after warping, and then we couldn't change what text was in them. So it's still much easier to use something like a true freeform envelope to make that happen. But especially if we're going to let this go into the world and expect that someone is going to start playing with it and changing the text, we may have to work on that piece. And in fact, I was kind of in the point of showing that I realized that Y wasn't very friendly. And I thought, well, the Y is not working great. I'm going to have to take a little look at why it's doing that and why we're having some issues, because I'm breaking that piece. Well, I might want to change my angle and the verticality. I might want to add a different control point. And after I do some of that work, I go, okay, now I have a shape that overall I'm doing a little bit less egregious alteration of the shapes that are inside of it. And even though it might not track that edge perfectly, I know that when I put other lettering inside of there, it's going to have less of an egregious effect on other letters that might end up in that corner. So part of thinking about templates and designs that other people are going to use is understanding that you can't just use your one use case, the one text that you think looks nice in there. You need to go through and think about the different kinds of shapes that fonts have in them, and that if another letter somehow ends up in there, even if it seems a little random or rare to you, that you want the letter to still be able to follow those lines without breaking or causing any clumps of stitching or anything that are untoward. When we have the freedom of freeform envelopes, it requires us to be um, a little more thoughtful about what can happen to letters when they warp. And also, it's why a lot of the fonts I've designed for this are made in the way that they are and have some alterations to thickness and thinness, and might require me to make some different changes. And you might even see that some of these work better than others. And I think that's the thing, is like when you're making a new template, you have to be very concerned with what someone might do that you're not planning on, right? Is there a possibility for people to break these things? Absolutely. The more extreme the thing you do to that particular piece, the more you can break something that's there. However, if you have some thoughtful concepts of what is going on and how the process works, how those shapes function, how the envelopes function, you have a better chance of doing it in a way that makes sense, that makes it work for people. Now, don't get me wrong. Ultimately, if someone goes in here, no matter what font you have, and types in something extreme, once again, we'll put excellent up in this top area where it really does not fit in that tiny little space. Can they get it to a point where maybe it's not going to work? Yeah, it might not work so great. We're starting to push things far. At the same time, will it stitch like that? Probably. I'm hoping that people are kind of intelligent enough to look at a piece and say that looks too clumpy, that looks weird, that's not working, something's not right about that, and decide not to do it. If they do decide to go through with it, well, then I'm hoping that they understand that it is as smashed together as it looks, and they're looking at the way the stitches work. Though I would say, looking at this piece, we've got a couple of high density areas, but this would probably tolerate stitching, even though I think that the letters that are in there won't be as legible as I would have them be. And hopefully someone would think twice about that as part of the design phase of laying that thing out, right? Of using that template that I released into the world. So here's hoping people would actually be somewhat thoughtful about how they use things. Anyway, all right, folks, I'm going to go ahead and let that go for today. We are gone longer than I expected to, and this is the full length for the show. I'm hopeful to have potentially a guest next week. We'll see. I'm working on some guests, but I will let you guys know, I'm about to move cross country. As that happens, particularly in the week that I am doing the move, being live will be probably out of the question during the time that I'm doing the big move. And there is entirely a chance you'll either get pre-recorded or nothing. I will try to give you an update, or even just a live video update to tell you what's going on in the world. But do know that that's coming, and still has been coming all this time. So I'm still very busy. I will try and get that going. And like I said, I may have some special guests as we get into there as well. So I know that was a lot of that was specific to Embrilliance and Stitch Artists and our software. But truth of the matter is, when we're talking about the freeform envelopes, it's kind of the only game in town for that. It's we do something different. And because people are asking me about these very specific pieces that I created, that's where I have to go. Other software status envelopes, we'll just kind of review that. There's warping. There's all sorts of things we can do. There's text manipulation out there in the world. With warping, I tend to think of that as the stuff that's more simple and done with parameters. But there are envelopes in other softwares. Some of them are rigid, meaning that you can't change everything. Whereas the ones we have are freeform. You can change more about them in the shapes. Just know that with freedom comes responsibility. You can break things. Last but not least, I just want to say, hey, folks, don't worry about being a typographical terror. Do worry about things stitching well and being legible for your own sake. But the default settings may not get you there. But if you keep trying and applying yourself, you are likely to make something that you love. All right, folks. So I'm going to go ahead and let that go right there. I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend. I'm going to go get busy on more of my tasks to move across country, but I will keep you guys in the loop. If you want to check out more of the stuff that I showed today, certainly there is that article. Go ahead and screenshot that if you want to from Images Magazine. The other thing I will recommend, and it is just where you need to be if you want to see either of the products that kind of came up today, get over to embrilliance.com. That's where you're going to find patch artists, because we had a lot of patch artist fans show up today, and we had people seeing Ace One. You want to see what that is? Go look over there. It'll show you what they are. And frankly, we don't mind, and I don't mind that if you've got other software, you use our software for what we do best. That is not a problem. In fact, I think that is just the way the embroidery world should work, lifting all of us up to do the best work that we can do. All right, folks, with that, I hope you guys have a good time. Get out there, try some stuff out, and can't wait to see you again next week.